Okay, so welcome to this session on Myers-Briggs. Have any of you come across Myers-Briggs before?
I done it years ago when I started my HR career, but you're talking like sort of, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago. But I found it very insightful and very good and quite scary how right it was.
Okay, great. Thanks, Debbie. One of the things I would say is if you want to ask a question, add a comment, anything like that, please feel free to either put your hands up if you would like to speak, or I have the chat function open on my monitor. So please feel free to use the chat function too. So if you see me looking that way, it's just that I'm just checking the chat as well. So I'm Rosalind Fawcett. I'm the Head of Diversity, Inclusion and Recruitment for the Legal Aid Agency, and I'm a Myers-Briggs practitioner. I agree with Debbie. I think it's a fascinating subject, but then I am fascinated by anything to do with people. And hopefully you will get some useful information out of today that you can take away with you. Okay, so hello, Michelle. I'm just ticking you off my list.
Hello, morning. Sorry, I couldn't get the link to work. Sorry.
That's quite all right. Don't worry. Okay, so we're just going into what is Myers-Briggs. So it is about helping you to understand yourself. So understanding why you might react to certain things in a certain way, why you like to work in different ways, what things are important to you when you're making decisions, that sort of thing. But it also helps you to understand other people's, because Myers-Briggs is made up of 8 pairings. And what you may find is that if you're in one preference, what you do isn't going to be comfortable for the opposite preference. So it helps to understand those different perspectives. Obviously, that means that it can help with team building, and it can also help with how you allocate tasks and work so that overall you get the best result. It can highlight potential areas for conflict. There are things that one preference will do that will irritate the hell out of the other preference. And it's worth being aware of those things so that you can mitigate that. What it isn't is it's nothing to do with your ability or your performance. So this is why it is not used in recruitment. You might have a preference for standing up and delivering training to lots of people. Doesn't actually mean you're any good at it. So it's nothing to do with your ability. And I'm going to make that quite clear, because just because you have one of the 2 preferences in each pair, it doesn't mean that you can't do the things that the other preference can do and do them well. So it's not about making excuses for yourself. So it's not about saying, oh, I can't do that because I have X preference. That doesn't work for me. Because it's not linked to capability, it is purely a preference. And we'll talk about that in just a second. And one key thing is it's not about putting people in boxes. So be very careful about thinking you know what kind of preference somebody has, because you may be right, but you may also be incorrect. So it's not for stereotyping. Now, I talked about preferences. So could you all please fold your arms? I can't see any of you, so I'm assuming you're doing it. Can you now fold them the other way? How does that feel?
A bit strange. You have to think about that.
Uncomfortable? Yeah. This is what we mean by preference. It's not that you can't do it. You can, obviously, but it's not the way you prefer to do it. Yes, so it tends to feel awkward. And it's just a little thing just to get across that thing about it is about preference. I sometimes also ask people to link their fingers, because we also have a preference for the way we do that. And if you do it the other way, again, it feels odd. It feels strange. So it helps you identify how to get the best out of people. We talk about preferences, and as I've already said, preferences are not abilities, they're not absolutes. It doesn't mean that you can't do what's on the other preference. One very key thing is that there are no better or worse types. When we go through this, you may look at the other preference and think, I wish I was more like that. Actually, in order to get the best overall results, we need people who have different preferences. And we'll talk about that as we go through. And it's about looking at your development. So looking at your preference and thinking, when does that work well for you? And when doesn't it work so well for you? And where it doesn't, what can you do to develop skills to be able to cope with that? So going into it, there are, as I say, 4 pairings. The first one is extroversion and introversion. What do those words mean to you?
Like an extrovert, an introvert, that sort of thing.
Thanks, Michelle. That is the way that we would normally interpret those words. It's not what it's meant within Myers-Briggs. It is purely about where you get your energy. So an extroversion preference gets their energy from outside, from people, from outside stimulus. Whereas an introversion gets their energy from being able to sit down and get on with something, work something through themselves. So it is a different approach to the way we work. But it's not about being an extrovert, life and soul of the party, or about being an introvert. It is purely about where you get your energy. Marie has asked, can we be both? You will find that you will have aspects of both. What I will send you after this, along with the slides and some extra information about the different letters that you might end up with, I'll also send you an Excel version of the questionnaire so that you can do that and see what yours comes out with. When you do that, you'll find there are 4 tabs and you have to fill in all 4. On the last tab there, it will give you your preference, an E or an I in this case. It will also tell you whether you are slight, moderate, clear or very clear. Now, if you have a very clear E, it doesn't mean that you are a really strong extroversion preference. What it means is the way you've answered the questions, the tool is very confident that that is your preference. So what you might find is you get an E, but it comes out as moderate or slight. And that might be because there are aspects of both that you use. When you do the questionnaire, one of the things that I would suggest you think about is, what would you do outside of work? And when we look at the characteristics, think about outside of work, because one of the things that happens when people fill in the questionnaire and we go through this is that they look at it from the point of view of what they've learned to do. So on the next section, which is sensing and intuiting, I came out as sensing for a few years because I was doing project management, and sensing is about detail. But actually my natural preference is the intuiting side. So you will have a preference, but you will probably use some of the things from the other preference. And the more you go through your career, the more you build your experience, build the different skills and things that you can do, the more you will start to use the things that are on the opposite preference to you. But if you think about it outside work, it's a little bit easier sometimes to think about which is actually your preference. Is that okay, Marie?
Yeah, that's lovely, thanks.
You're welcome. Okay, so we'll start looking at the characteristics. So an extroversion preference, they like to talk things through. They tend to act before possibly thinking things all the way through. They like to think out loud, which can be really irritating for an introversion preference. Hi, Gwen. So,
hi, apologies for being late.
That's okay, don't worry, Gwen. They gain their energy from interaction, from that outside stimulus. They dislike working on one thing for any length of time. So I'm a fairly clear extroversion preference. So I love working with people. I'm not very good with routine. I don't like it. I like to do lots of different things. And that's very key in my extroversion preference. The introversion preference will want to think things through before acting. So they like to be able to reflect. If you go to someone in a meeting, someone who has an introversion preference, and you ask them a very direct question, it's likely that it's not going to feel comfortable, because an introversion preference likes to reflect before talking. They like to think things through. They like to sit down and work something out for themselves. They like quieter places. They're really, really good at concentrating on that piece of work and getting it done. So a couple of examples on that. You get people coming out of a meeting. Quite often you might get an introversion preference coming out of a meeting thinking, why didn't I say that? Why didn't I speak up? On the other hand, you might get an extroversion preference coming out thinking, why on earth did I say that? Should have thought that through. Another one is about problem solving. So an introversion preference might take that problem solving and want to work it through themselves, whereas an extroversion preference might want to brainstorm with somebody else. Have you got a fairly clear idea of where you sit?
I thought I did, but now reading that, I'm not so sure.
Okay. In what way, Rachel?
I always thought I was a natural introvert at work, but actually, and I'm thinking about this in the work context, which is obviously the wrong way to do it, as you said. But I do sometimes exhibit some of the extroversion characteristics where I go to people for advice and talk things through when I'm unsure. But I think that's a learned experience again. So I think I'm confusing myself by overthinking it, which might be an example of one or other of these as well.
Yes, it's you will have learned to do certain things. Another example with extroversion and introversion is writing papers. So with an extroversion preference, someone's likely to want to talk through the big picture, the idea, and then write the paper. An introversion preference may prefer to write the paper and then get feedback. So Marie says she sits in the middle, depending on how she feels on the day. Again, what I would say is think about outside work. Simply because we learn how to behave, and sometimes that can influence the way we look at this. Okay, so thinking about those things, Yvonne and Debbie are typing. I'll come back to them when it comes up on my chat. So Debbie thinks she's a definite E, but with a few I behaviours. So you need that reflection. Yep. Tracy, you got your hand up.
Yeah, all I wanted to say was on Teams, I haven't got the chat bit. It seems to have disappeared, my ability to do a bit of a conversation. So I'm struggling a bit. I don't know if it's a rollout of Teams or what, but so I'm going to find it hard to contribute unless I'll try going out and coming back in again.
Okay. Okay. I will read out the stuff that comes out on the chat function. If you're happy to put your hand up, Tracy, then that will be great. But yes, if you want to kind of log out and come back in again, then
I'll try
yeah.
better first. Yeah.
Okay.
But in terms of where I am,
Sorry, go on.
in terms of where I am in terms of this, years ago I would have said I was definitely I, and I think I am still I, but with aspects of E.
Mhm.
So, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And you will learn how to do the things that are not in your preference. Rachel, you had your hand up? Oh, you're typing now instead.
I was just about to say to Tracy, but she can't see the chat, so that would be unhelpful to her. Sometimes you can access the chat under more, the three little dots at the top, if it doesn't come up instantly for you. It might not, but sometimes it's there instead.
Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you. Yeah, it's not there at the minute, but it may pop back up. Thank you for that.
Okay. Yvonne's come through saying she's on the introversion side. I said right at the beginning that it was not about capability. One of the best trainers that I have ever worked with in my entire career was a very clear introversion preference. So it is clearly not about capability. She had, because training was part of her role, she had learned how to make herself comfortable. Kim, think you're a bit of both? As I say, again, I would think about outside work. So one of the questions I sometimes ask here is, you're in the office and everybody's going to go out for a drink, but they're going to be out for a while. Do you prefer to go straight out, or do you prefer to go home first and then go out? What do we think?
Shall I answer?
Okay, yes, thanks,
Yeah.
Marie.
Yeah, I prefer to go straight out.
Yeah.
If I go home, I'm
yeah.
not going to go back out again.
Yeah, okay. Marie, you've got your hand up?
Yeah, I think it does depend on the day for me, because if I've had a long day, if I want to just be away from people, I'd want to go home. But otherwise, yeah, I'm quite happy to go straight out. So
Fair enough. Very good. Interestingly, Yvonne's put that she'd go out first but would leave early. And again, that's not atypical of an introversion preference. That yes, we'll go out, we'll do the social bit, but I'm not going to commit to a whole evening, and I'm going to go home. And it's not about pigeonholing people. So for me, I, as I said, am a very clear extroversion preference. However, if you asked me before I got my puppy how I relaxed, I would have said sitting and reading a book. So sitting on my own in the quiet, reading a book. So there are aspects of both. Okay, so if you are an introversion preference, how are you going to engage your colleagues who have an extroversion preference? So if you were in a meeting, how would you make that meeting work for both preferences?
Would you have perhaps different types of media? So some face-to-face stuff, some on the computer screen, and then allow space for talk, and ensure you can look around the room when you're leading a meeting and see who looks as though they're trying to get a word in.
Yep, absolutely, Michelle. Yeah, totally. Yes, with your extroversion preferences, you've got to allow that sort of brainstorming, that chat through that social environment. We'll go through some of these. So involve them in brainstorming or thought showering, as they say in schools. They will enjoy that side of it in the planning sessions. Don't necessarily ask them to work alone on long projects. Ask them to be a critical friend when you want to talk things through. That will work. But you do need to create that social environment. So when you're planning a meeting, perhaps make sure that you allow some time for that non-work chat. You might also want to set some ground rules, because one of the things with an extroversion preference is trying to keep them on point. That can sometimes be quite difficult. They will quite often go off on a tangent. So the ground rules can work quite well. When I do this course face to face, and basically I have flip chart at either end of the room, and I will give people a question to answer. And the extroversion preferences will start answering it before I've actually finished, because they want to get on with it, and they will be a lot noisier than the introversion group. And one of the interesting things for me is the state of the flip chart at the end of it. The extroversion preferences, there's lots of colours, they're all in different directions. It's perhaps a bit messy for the introversion preferences. The introversion preferences, what I tend to see is bullet points, and it's all very straightforward and neat. So it's about working with different preferences and making that work. If you're an extroversion preference and you're working with an introversion preference, then don't expect them to speak out in the meeting quite as much. And that's not true of all introversion preferences, because people learn that that's what they need to do, that they need to be able to speak up. But the second point there, allow them time to reflect, is really, really key. So in the space of a meeting, making sure that before the meeting, you're not just sharing an agenda, you're actually giving them information on what it is you're going to want to talk about with them. What ideas are you trying to get? So that they have that time before the meeting to reflect and come in with those ideas, instead of being put on the spot. The being put on the spot, as I said earlier, can make them very uncomfortable. So there are ways around asking those questions. So if, I think it was Yvonne who said she had an introversion preference, if I turned to Yvonne and said, what do you think, in a meeting, when she hadn't had time to prepare, Yvonne, how would that make you feel?
Probably a bit of a startled rabbit in headlights.
Yep, which is not unusual for someone with an introversion preference. However, there are different ways of asking questions. So you can ask things like, instead of asking Yvonne, what do you think, asking, how do you think your team might feel about that? Because it takes the focus off them as an individual, it can feel a little bit more comfortable. And also be very careful of the use of why. Why can be quite confrontational. So instead of asking, why do you want to do that? Or why didn't you do that? Change it to, what made you? What stopped you? Changing it to the what and stopped, or what and made, or that sort of thing, takes that confrontation out of the question. So also it doesn't feel quite as in your face. But the absolute thing to do is about allowing time to reflect. If you can't do it before the meeting, then leave the decision making open afterwards if you can, so that again, your introversion preference colleagues can actually have time to reflect and input to what's actually happening, because they have great ideas too. They have a lot of experience and knowledge too, and you need to be able to tap into that. Any questions or thoughts on that? Okay, we will move on to the second pairing. Okay, so this is about sensing and intuiting. The only reason it's an N is because obviously we've already had an I for introversion preference. So again, this isn't about being sensible, or there is a link to using your senses, and it's not about being intuitive. It's about the information that you want. So sensing preference will want detail, will want facts and figures, will want to know what's happening now. An intuiting preference will want to see the big picture. They'll want to know where it fits. They'll want to know why. What's the purpose? What are we doing? So if I asked you as a group, I said to you, okay, you as a group have been asked to set up and run a staff event. What information are you going to want to know? And as I said, please feel free to use the chat function or pop your hand up. A few people typing. The objectives, yeah. Which section of staff? How many people? How many? Theme, staff roles, yeah. Lots of things in there. So when you're looking at things like which section of staff, how long is the presentation? Hybrid, face-to-face or online? How many? Theme, staff roles, what resources? Those are all detail. So they're all the detail things, they're sensing type preference. Okay. Now the objectives that Rachel's put on there, that would fit more into the intuiting preference. Date and time, what's required, date and time. So it sounds like we've got quite a lot of sensing preferences on this call. I've done this with my wider team and they came up with lots of similar things. And then they asked me what I would ask. And I said, my first question would be why? Why are we doing it? What are we trying to achieve? And that's because my preference is on the intuiting side, that big picture. Okay. So Faith is typing. We will move on to the characteristics and I'll come back to Faith's comment when it's finished. Okay, so a sensing preference will want the facts and figures, the details. Okay, it doesn't mean that they won't look at the big picture, but they'll want the details first. So, and they want to know about what it is now, is the here and now. It has to be specific and realistic. They will collect observations, and that's where the link to your senses comes in that quite often a sensing preference will use all of their senses or a lot of them to collect that information. An intuiting preference is more interested in the connections. So where does it fit? That big picture. So how is it going to help us achieve our objectives, our goals as an organisation? What's the point? Why are we doing it? Quite often we'll like to use their imagination because they will be thinking about, oh, great, Tracy, fab. They will be thinking about the future. So Tracy's just said that the chat function is back. So whereas your sensing preferences will be looking at the here and now, the practical, your intuiting preferences will be thinking about the future. So, okay, so that what's that going to mean going forward? How does that feel for everybody? Do you have a clear idea of which one you're likely to come out as?
I think I use intuiting more than sensing. I like to know what I will use sensing to put the sort of meat on the bones, but first I like to know what the skeleton looks like. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. It's back to that thing of it's nothing to do with yeah. So there's a lot of sensing coming through, but with some intuiting. And again, we learn. And some of that is learned because of the role that we're doing at the moment. I mentioned earlier that I'd done the questionnaire and I'd come out as sensing, but that was because I was doing project management and I'm reasonably good at project management. So it's nothing, as I keep saying, it's nothing about ability. But my preference is about the intuiting, the big picture. Okay, good. Okay, so as a group, you have been tasked with organising an office move. So again, what information would you be looking for? Debbie gets frustrated with the intuiting behaviours. Yeah, you'll find that your intuiting colleagues will also get frustrated with the sensing behaviours. What date is the move? Why, where, who, and when? Yeah. Why are we moving? Yeah. So again, lots of sensing stuff, but some of that why. Why is it happening? Okay. All right, so if you are an intuition preference and you are working with sensing, so you're an intuition preference and you are working with Debbie, who finds some of that frustrating, how are you going to engage your sensing preference colleagues?
Have some of the detail ready, or ask them what detail they will need so that you can get ready for them.
Yeah, absolutely. Any other thoughts?
I was just thinking you probably need both, don't you?
Oh, yes.
So,
absolutely.
Yeah, play to people's strengths, perhaps.
Yes. Yeah, really good point, Marie. Michelle, I think you started to come in there too.
Yeah, I was just going to say, you know, if you can get ideas from both ends of that spectrum, the stuff that then you have in the middle will probably be a really quite a good solution.
Yeah, totally. So if you are working with sensing preferences, you do need to be specific and practical about things. You do need to have plans, allow time for the questions. Yes, absolutely, Kim. Sorry, is it? I can't tell whether it's Kim James or James Kim. Is it Kim? Not to worry. It's just that the name, it's Kim, great. It's just the name comes up differently on the chat function. Pay attention to risk. So one of the things with an intuition preference is that can be quite frustrating for those with the sensing preference is they seem to sort of go off on a wild ideas. You need to be thinking about the practical. You need to be thinking about the risk of doing things. So if you are a sensing preference and you're working with intuition preferences, how are you going to engage them?
Ask for ideas, maybe.
Fab. Yep. Yeah. Use their imagination, get some ideas. Okay. Don't give them too much detail. Give them what they need, but don't overload them. You need to be thinking about where does it fit? Why are we doing it? What's the purpose? And then with a sensing preference, once you thought about the purpose, you also need to think about how are you going to measure success? So you need to be thinking about that big picture. How does it fit with other things that are happening? Using them to challenge. Really, really important. My previous role to this was head of continuous improvement. And if we were looking at a process, we would map out the process. And there are two ways to look for improvements. One is what they call the iterative approach, where we would look at each step of the process, figure out where the issues were, and solve those issues. Now that is much more comfortable for your sensing preference because it's very factual. It's here and now. The other way to look at improvements is almost to ignore the current process and say, okay, if we were starting from scratch, how would we do this? And that will appeal more to your intuition preferences. So both sides need to challenge the other. The sensing needs to keep the intuition realistic, and the intuition needs to move the sensing preference on sometimes when it's getting bogged down in what we do now. Okay. If you have any questions through all of this, please just shout up. So then on to the third of the pairings, and this is thinking and feeling, sometimes referred to as head and heart. It does not mean that those with a thinking preference are heartless, or that those with a feeling preference are a pushover. It is purely about what we use to make decisions. Okay, so I will go through the characteristics and then I will ask you a question. So a thinking preference applies logic. You know, it has to be objective. They will focus on that analysis. They'll be influenced by data and cause and effect. So they'll want to see that both sides of that. They prefer calm, objective interactions. They don't like so much the heated conversations. They want people to be calm and objective when discussing things where people don't agree. They can sometimes, when giving feedback, be very focused on the constructive side of feedback. So what needs to improve? On the feeling side, it's about people. It's about the impact on people. So they will work very much from their individual values as to what they think is right when dealing with people. It is about the effect on people. They will make decisions based on the needs, emotions, feelings of people involved. And when they give feedback, often they can concentrate on the praise, the appreciation. Tracy's just asked, is it possible to be both in a situation? You will still have a preference. You will have one or the other as a preference, but you will probably have learned to do the other one for very good reasons. So I'm going to ask you a quick question now. You as a team, or your team even, have been nominated for an awards ceremony, and it's in the Bahamas, but only 2 people can go. How are you going to decide who should go?
Draw straws.
Michelle, draw straws? Yep. The 2 that contributed the most. Rachel? Yep. Look at who had the most input. Equal chances. Ask volunteers and pick 2 from a hat. Okay, a draw. Lottery, yeah. Does anyone need it most? It's a nice thought. Who's available? Yep. So some interesting things there, but completely different. So all the things like drawing straws, names out of a hat, equal chances, all of those are very much typical of a feeling preference. They're looking at who's had the most input and the 2 that contributed the most. Then that is very typical of a thinking preference. Key thing here is that both preferences are seeking to be fair. It is just that they have a different approach to how that fairness happens. Okay, so if you have a feeling preference, and from the chat it looks like quite a few of you have, how are you going to engage your thinking preference, colleagues? Got a few people typing. Means I can drink my coffee. No. People have stopped typing now, apart from Tracy. Facts and figures and a goal. Yep. Fairness and equality and possible consequences. Yeah, if just based on performance. So actually putting that feeling preference spin on how we look at things. Yeah. Okay. So you do need to be logical, objective. So it may be that you're talking about the impact on people, but wherever possible, back that up with evidence. Evidence doesn't have to be data. It doesn't have to be figures. It can be feedback. It can be information that you've got about how people feel about a certain thing. That is still stuff that can be analysed. It is still stuff that can be taken into account, facts. You do need to think about the principles. Using their critical faculties, so getting them to challenge and work through with you how we deal with the impacts on people. And occasionally you need to remind them that their decisions do affect people. Okay, so what if you're a thinking preference? How are you going to engage and work with your feeling preference colleagues?
Explain how you came to decisions. So what your rationale was so that they understand how you reach that. So something like that example, just where it doesn't automatically seem fair across the board, but actually why you came to that decision and why you think it's fair, perhaps.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Any other thoughts? Okay. You do need to show concern for the impact on people. People are our most important and most expensive resource. Not just obviously salary, pension, all of that sort of thing, but recruitment, training, all of that comes into it as well. So to make decisions without taking into account the impact on people, you might be setting yourself up for lots of problems. So you do need to think about that side of things. Build alliances with them and use their skills. So working with a feeling preference, I was talking earlier about questions, and one of the questions I said was about, so how would your team feel about that? Actually using your colleagues who've got a feeling preference to sound out the plan for communicating, for consulting staff, for actually feeding in that information is really, really useful. Okay, you do, as Rachel said, you do need to be quite clear about how you've made this decision, because your feeling preference colleagues do need to understand, but if you really want them to buy into it, you need to show that you've taken into account the impact on people. You could move to a new office and be absolutely right on that it's the right location for the business, it's got the right kit, the cost was right, all of those sorts of things. But if that means that you have a demoralized staff, then your productivity is going to go down, your absence is going to go up, your attrition, losing people, is going to go up. So it's really important to do both. Now, with a thinking preference, when they're looking at a problem or something like that, they tend to step out of it so that they can be objective. With a feeling preference, they want to step into it. They want to find out what is the impact on people. So it's a slightly different approach, but both of those are completely valid. So if you are problem solving or making decisions, and all you have is the sensing and thinking preferences, what do you think is going to happen?
The outcome could appear a little bit cutthroat, perhaps, to the rest of the feeling type staff.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep. Not thinking about the effect on people. A PowerPoint with a graph. Yes, good point. And quite often a graph that doesn't actually explain what it's telling you. If you have only sensing and thinking, then what you have is a very here and now solution, a very here and now decision. It may not fit into other things that are happening around the organisation. It may not, as you've said, it may not have the right impact on our people. So whilst it can have all the logic and all the facts and on that data sheet or on that graph be absolutely the right decision, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be the right decision. So what happens if all you have is intuiting and feeling, so big picture and the impact on people? No evidence. Yep, absolutely right, Tracy. Maybe not viable, bit flimsy. Yep. I'd say one of the key things here is you might not actually get anything done. Because if all we're thinking about is the big picture, the concept, less focus, Marie, absolutely. And we're doing lots and lots of consultation with people. And yeah, they absolutely, Liz, they could make decisions that actually don't work for the business. If they actually make any decisions at all. So what you actually need for good problem solving, good decision making, is all of these things. Not necessarily in that order. You might start with the big picture and then go to the detail. But you do need all four of those in order to have that right decision, to come up with the right solution to your issue. Okay, I know we're going through this faster than we originally said, 2 hours. When this was originally set up, it was going to be a smaller group and we were going to do some group work. As this is being recorded as well, the group work wouldn't help with that. So we're just going through it, so you will get a bit of time back today. So we're on to the last pairing, which is judging and perceiving. And it's not about being judgmental or about being perceptive. It's about how you like the world around you to be. So key thing with a judging preference is they like to come to a decision and get on with things. Yes, Yvonne, I'll be sending the slides out to you afterwards. The perceiving preference likes to keep their options open for as long as possible. Okay. So I have a question for you before we go through the characteristics. How do you plan and do your food shopping?
I have a list.
Marie, you have a list. Do you stick to it?
Not completely, but it's there as a basis.
Okay, good. So Ellen doesn't have, I take it that means you don't have a list. Michelle writes a list after checking what she needs. Yeah. Having a list and open to extra. Writing a list and then it goes out the window. Yeah, forgetting to take it with you. I like that, Faith. I have a list for decoration. Okay, so this is an interesting one. When I've done this session before with people, I've had someone with a judging preference who goes through her recipe books on the Sunday, decides decides what she's going to cook for the week, does her shopping list, does her shopping on the Monday. The shopping list is written in the order that the aisles are in the supermarket, and she only buys what's on that list. And on the front of her fridge, she has something that says what they're going to be eating each night. That is a very clear judging preference. The perceiving preference has a tendency to do things like write a list and then ignore it, or just wandering around. I did this with a member of my team who suddenly said, now I know why I don't like going shopping with my mum, because the person in my team was very much a judging preference and her mum was very much a perceiving preference. So she just wanted to go in, go up and down the aisles, get what she needed and pay, and her mum was wandering up and down. Marie's saying that one of her daughters does exactly that with the recipes and everything. So organised. It's great. There are times where I would love to be more on the judging side. I'm very clear on the perceiving side. I wouldn't waste food. The other question I often ask on this is, how full is your freezer? Because what will quite often happen with a perceiving preference is that the freezer will be jam-packed. Yeah, Debbie? Yeah. Because we buy things to eat and then decide we don't want to eat them that night, so we put them in the freezer. My freezer is always so packed I can't get anything else in. Yeah. Need to declutter. Yes, I have to do that too. So going through the characteristics of a judging and perceiving preference. So as I said, they like to come to a closure. They like to make decisions. They like plans and structure. Okay, so they tend to be quite organised. They know what they're doing and when they're doing it. They prefer to act within that structure. So if you go to somebody with a judging preference at 4 o'clock on a Friday and ask them to drop what they're doing and do something else, it's likely not to be very popular. Doesn't mean they won't do it, but they aren't going to like doing it because they've planned what they're going to do, and that's what they want to do. The perceiving preference will, as I said before, keep their options open, so delay decisions. They like that spontaneity, remaining flexible. They're quite good at responding to emerging information. So that whole thing of that last minute task, dropping what you're doing and taking on something else, that is less likely to be upsetting for someone with a perceiving preference. Like to go with the flow. As it says here, frustrated by rules and routines. Yeah, you know, it's let's wing it, as some of the shopping things actually said, shopping comments. Like that spontaneity. You will also see a difference in the way that they approach a task. So with a judging preference, they've got a goal that's here and they start here. They will plan it and they will do their steps so that it goes to where they need to be. With a perceiving preference, you'll have the same goal and the same starting point, and they'll do a bit at the beginning and then not a lot. And then right before the deadline, they'll do loads and loads of work. So they'll both get it done, but it's ways of working with these different preferences. So Debbie's saying that she's very much in the middle of thinking and feeling and judging and perceiving. Yeah, have a look at the questionnaire. I would say when you're thinking about the questionnaire, think about outside work, because one of them will be your preference, but you will have learned to use the other preference skills as well. Okay, so working with, I'm going to go through this. So if you're working with judging preferences, be conscious of start and end times. Have some kind of structure, have an agenda. Make your materials neat so that they're nice and easy for everyone to see what's going on. Go through your things systematically. Don't go all over the place. Avoid those last minute changes if you can. If you can't, then you need to kind of put the why in there, why it has to be done, and use their time management abilities. So use them to actually manage and organise that work. With your perceiving preferences, you do need to be flexible. So you need to build in some time and space for some spontaneity. It says here, avoid tight deadlines. What I find, and I know it works for me as a perceiving preference and works for other colleagues who are perceiving preference, is don't just have an end deadline. Set some milestones, so some miniature deadlines in between. Because if what they're doing, other people are dependent on them doing it, it's best to be able to monitor, are they on track to doing it? And if you set mini deadlines, they'll do it by those mini deadlines, rather than leaving it right at the end. So it's a good idea to use those sorts of things. It says here, using their ability to explore new possibilities. So looking at, well, okay, what else could we do? How could we do it differently? I was saying about the continuous improvement and just putting the process to one side and saying, okay, if we're starting again, what would we do? How could we do it differently? So how does that feel on the judging and perceiving? Okay. Okay, some thumbs up, fabulous. This is one of my favourite quotes from a perceiving preference. I'm not procrastinating, I'm proactively delaying the implementation of the energy intensive phase of the project until the enthusiasm factor is at its maximum effectiveness. That's that thing about all that work right at the end. Okay, so what we need you to do is, as I said, I will send you the slides. I will also send you another slide pack that has a bit more of an explanation of the different types. And I will send you the questionnaire so that you can have a go at that. And obviously you'll have my email address, so you can come back to me if you have any questions on it. But what we'd like you to think about taking away from this are these 4 bullet points. So how are you going to communicate and engage with everybody, whatever their preference? Looking at your own development needs. So looking at each of those pairings, and as I said at the beginning, looking at, so if I'm an extroversion preference, when does my extroversion preference work well for me? And when does it work less well for me? So it might work well for me in that I like doing things like this. I like running training. I like interacting with people. It may work less well for me in meetings because I'm talking too much. So I've learned various things to make sure that what I'm actually doing is pulling other people into the conversation. So it's looking at, okay, so where it doesn't work as well, what can I do to still engage and communicate with people? Building your team, so getting them to understand each other, and identifying gaps in your team. So if, say, in your team, all you have are sensing preferences, how are you going to build in that big picture thinking? How are you going to build in that challenge around why are we doing it? What's the purpose? Okay. So that is about it for me. Do you have any questions or any thoughts? So Maria's said that it's been useful, good. Trainee assessor, good, yes. The Myers-Briggs training is good. It's not cheap to be a practitioner because it's only the Myers-Briggs company who run it. So I think it's about 3,500. but that does make you a practitioner and gives you access to lots of things. So if it's something that would be useful in your area of the business, it may be worth talking to your line manager, whoever controls your L&D budget, to see if it's worth having people trained up. I've got 2 more people in my team about to be trained up, because at the moment it's kind of just me within the LAA. So have a think about that too. And if you have any questions about that, please drop me a line. I will send everything out to you today. And as I say, you'll have my email address. So if you have any questions, please feel free to drop me a line. Okay. Thank you very much. I will stop the recording now.
Thank you, Rosalind.
Thank you.